Hello, I'm Justin Ritchie from the University of British Columbia, where I am a PhD candidate at the Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability. And today, for the Unraveling Systems video series, I will be speaking about household debt and the environment. And so there are many ways to talk about household debt and the environment. But I just wanted to start out by discussing that household debt has increasingly financed the expansion of consumer societies in North America, Europe, and across the globe. And we can look at data to verify that. The US household debt to GDP ratio was down around 20 to 30% for much of the early 20th century. And then the post-war boom saw it rise to more than 40%. And then in 2005 to 2006, it hit a peak of close to 95% of GDP until it fell down to about 80% where it is today. And the US is very typical for an OECD developed country. China is a developing country, and they have followed a similar trend, except post 2008, where household debt to GDP has risen to almost 40%. We can look at Canada, and we see that the household debt to GDP is now above where it was in the US when the housing crash happened. We can look at Australia, where it's hit over 120% of GDP. Germany, however, is an exception. Their household debt to GDP has actually been falling. And I would argue that a lot of that has to do with the way that housing is financed in Germany. There are many more options than just taking on a mortgage, as in many other countries. But I would also say that it has to do with a larger transfer to other Eurozone countries because Germany is a major exporter. And so we can look at Greece's household debt to GDP rose quite dramatically over that same period. And we can look at Spain, which also rose dramatically over the same period we've been looking at in the early 21st century until really post 2010, once the Eurozone debt crisis became much more severe, it started to decline. Now, what we can talk about regarding a few social effects of expanding household debt is that it's allowing us to overshoot our ecological stock of capital and maintain unsustainable purchasing patterns for long periods of time. And so I am just looking at a few social effects of this expanding household debt, which primarily has to do with increasing the total stock of acquisitions in society for several key reasons. And I'm reading a really great book right now called The Empire of Things by Frank Trentman, and it's about the history of consumerism. And he touches on a few of these different explanations for why consumerism takes hold, but expanding household debt is one of those factors. And I'll just point out that it's not as important about the, debt to GDP ratio for households. That actual number doesn't mean a whole lot. What matters is the trend, and that it's been accelerating dramatically throughout the early 21st century. So what household debt allows us to do, in addition to taking on our day-to-day expenses that are more so than ever having to be financed through credit cards and taking on smaller amounts of debt, when we take on mortgages, as in many Anglo-Saxon countries and British Commonwealth countries and the U.S., it has to do with these three factors of aspirational expansion of household debt, peer maintenance, and also signaling. So essentially what's happening is we can aspire to be like the higher luxury consumers above us, and that leads us to make purchases to look more like them. And so that's actually one of the explanations around the history of consumerism and why it took hold, partly in industrial Britain, is this kind of aspirational spending where we'll see a new trendy clothing item or something and go out and purchase it. And maybe you or I wouldn't do this, but a lot of people do that. They see the newest haircut on a celebrity, or whatever the royalty is wearing, and they'll go out and purchase that. But then actually, I would argue what has an even bigger impact is just peer group maintenance, where if you see yourself as part of the middle class, and the middle class, has a car and a house, and a particular type of job that traps you in a particular cycle where maintaining that becomes quite a bit of an expenditure. And these peer group maintenance expenditures, I would argue, are a really big factor, especially in OECD countries around purchasing. But also, it has to do with signaling that, I'm not part of another social group. I'm part of a certain social group because I'm making these purchases and I'm taking on these acquisitions. So what we can look at in regards to housing, which is where I want to focus on household debt and the environment, is that in one of the interviews we did on our podcast, we spoke with Michael Hudson, who is a historian of economic thought, and he points out that in England, Canada, US, and Australia, more than 80% of the loans on the books of banks are in real estate. And so we could look at, consumerism issues, the material flow of the consumption goods, or, the values that a consumer society propagates, or the psychological drivers related to acquisition and novelty. But I really want to focus on this housing issue because it has a severe environmental impact. And household debt in all of those countries we were looking at the start of the talk has been the wedge that has allowed housing to transform from a basic need and into an asset that yields investment returns. And for a long time, a house was something that you purchased in order to live there. And of course, there was always, property investment, speculative property investment going on. But in today's world, in 2016, when I'm recording this talk, this has truly become a massive driver of not only people's lives, but just urban living in general. And so this has caused a global construction glut. And so Ireland and Spain, they're a great example. They created twice as many dwellings per capita than other European countries in the early 21st century. In Mexico, housing construction sector grew 12% in 2004, which is 4 times more than their GDP. Canada is also another country where our economy is heavily reliant on rapidly expanding construction sector. China, 4.4 billion cubic meters of residential housing between 2000 and 2010, which is enough for 175 million people, alongside a population growth of 75 million. And so the Chinese economist Yi Jianrong, he pointed out when he did a study of electricity meters across China that over 64.5 million of urban electricity meters registered zero use for a period of longer than 6 months, leading him to argue that there's that many vacant units across China. But other data indicate that there's about 20% vacancy rate for residential property and 60 to 90% for luxury property. In the United States, about 8.5% of dwellings were vacant in 2011, which are 11 million empty homes. And one of the studies that looks at this phenomenon and from which these data points come from is this reference here at the bottom of this slide. But that 11 million empty homes is more than 3 times the number of housing units needed for the U.S. homeless population. Brazil is another country that's built a lot of housing, much more per capita than population growth would indicate. And Sao Paulo alone has 1.1 million vacant houses, they point out, and they have a population of about 20 million people. So 5% to 10% vacancy rate in many cities is quite common now. But on a city of a massive scale like Sao Paulo, that leads to a huge number of vacant homes. So what I argue is that buildings generate 30 to 40% of GHG emissions in most OECD countries, and a little bit less than that in a lot of the developing world. And this system of short-term market gain that has been fueled by household debt outpaces the kinds of decisions that can build sustainable and efficient housing stock. And household debt is just accelerating this process. So here's a picture of Vancouver where I live. The skyline is beset by mountains, which makes it look quite beautiful. But realistically, a lot of the residential towers that are downtown, which are most of them, are built really shoddily. There are all these stories at my institute where one of my colleagues, he's working on a study of putting energy metrics on condo purchases. So when people buy them, they can see, kind of how shoddily built they are and hopefully factor that into their decision. So when he was doing some surveys with people saying, are you going to use this or not? The answer he got back is like, I'm only planning to hold this for a few years because I really want to flip this, and energy use is not going to factor at all into my decision. So another colleague, when they were looking at downtown with a heat gun, what you can see is that they're often natural gas heated, these towers. And in the winter, they just look like giant heat spikes because they were built with standard seafoam glass, low energy efficiency construction, and they just leak heat. And unfortunately, these buildings are minimum 30 to 40 year commitments, and they're just hugely wasteful in terms of energy. And a lot of them have been built with capitalizing on this property ladder mindset. But this is not just a Vancouver thing. This is happening in New York and London and San Francisco and Hong Kong and all over. And so Vancouver, BC is just a microcosm. And we can look at carbon emissions from a lot of the leading emitters around the world. And what we can see is that China has truly skyrocketed in the last few years. And this is from a 2015 study out of Harvard on China's GHG emissions. But when 70% of the Chinese GDP is investment, and a huge part of it goes into building a lot of these towers, often on farmland and displacing people. There was a really great Vice documentary on the series Vice on HBO a few years ago that was specifically about this. The correspondent, he goes to Ordos in Inner Mongolia, and he sees that these massive towers, just like the ones I was showing you in the skyline of Vancouver a moment ago, are being built in farmland. And it's not encouraging any kind of mixed-use, sustainable urbanism. It's just truly something that is mind-boggling in terms of the environmental sustainability of building it. So there's the upfront commitment in terms of environmental impact on the housing stock when it's constructed, but it's also being overbuilt. It's also being built in ways that encourage fossil fuel land use patterns, and it's also driving this huge boost in emissions. I would argue in China, a good chunk of that is coming from this overbuilding and construction and the coal and the raw materials that fuel that huge chunk of construction. If you can think of, 70% of China's GDP as investment, roughly about 70% of those emissions are going into investment in construction stock around the country. So it's a huge factor. So if we go back to this kind of pattern, which builds on some of the ideas in this Empire of Things book, aspirational, peer signaling, what we can see is that in terms of housing, we're taking each of these factors and building it into taking on household debt to achieve these things. And it means that in places like Vancouver and San Francisco and London, there's a huge number of people who are being pushed out into the suburbs, and it's encouraging sprawl, and it's encouraging unsustainable land use patterns because we all want the same kinds of things in terms of housing. And it means that basically there's a huge pile of money from around the world that is flowing into these international real estate markets, and it's having a huge impact on the environmental sustainability of our cities. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak about this, and be sure to check out our website at www.extraenvironmentalist.com for interviews with some of the authors that we've mentioned and many more conversations on these topics. And thanks for the opportunity to participate in the Unraveling Systems video series.